Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see you all, or at least feel your presence here tonight. And I'm really overjoyed at the interest in this important topic. I hope we'll be able to meet all of us in person someday soon at Mohonk Mountain House. I'm Louisa Finn, Secretary of Mohonk Consultations and descendant of our founder, Keith Smiley. When Keith formed Consultations in 1980, he was thinking about establishing a group whose work on environmental concerns would include work on social concerns, with the awareness that the way humans treat each other is inextricable from the way we treat the earth. Consultations' mission is to support the interrelationship of all life and develop practical means for sustainability through dialogue. Pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID, we strive to bring diverse groups of people to Mohonk Mountain House to converse about the myriad of challenges that face us as human beings living on the planet. Since the late 1800s, Mohonk and the Smiley family have had a long history of facilitating dialogue in pursuit of peace. Before I talk about tonight's event, I'd like to mention the work Mohonk Consultations has done recently. We hosted two well-received webinars this past winter, one on plastic waste featuring Judith Enck, and one on building common ground with others featuring Dennis Kucinich. For those of you on our mailing list, our schedule will be a little bit different this year, with our Distinguished Achievement Award being given in September rather than in June. This year, it will be given to the Center for Creative Education, a dynamic organization in Kingston. So we hope you'll all come out for that party. Also be on the lookout for our November conference. It will be a full day exploration of strategies for dealing with plastic waste. Over our 40-year history, Mohonk Consultations has done many programs related to farming in the Hudson Valley. In the early 1990s, we co-founded Phillies Bridge Farm, one of the area's first CSAs, where one of our panelists tonight, Riston Mays, now farms. So in some ways, tonight feels full circle. However, we've been missing a big part of the farming story. Perched as we are on the centennial of the Tulsa Massacre and the nation's reckoning with racial justice, our topic tonight is fitting. Though we can't change the past, we can look at it more honestly and allow our sharpened perception to instruct us on how to move forward. For help with that process, tonight we're going to listen to two Black farmers and a land conservationist. We hope they will help us shed light on past harms and lead us forward into a more inclusive, healthy relationship with each other and with the soil that feeds us. Our partners in this event are the SUNY New Paltz Black Lives Matter Coalition and the Sustainability Learning Community. Joining us tonight are SUNY Representative Sarah Wyman, Director of the Faculty Center, and Assistant Melissa Paniagua, recent SUNY graduate with a double major in finance and Black studies. Our first speaker tonight is Allison Espinoza, who has her own farm called Rootworkers Croft in West Bloomfield, New York. Allison is a certified vet tech and farmer of animals and herbs. After Allison, we'll hear from Riston Mays, Assistant Farm Manager at Phillies Bridge Farm. Finally, we'll be listening to Shaniqua Bowden, who works for the Kingston Land Trust. Following the speakers, we'll have questions from SUNY students moderated by Melissa Paniagua, and then we'll open it up to audience questions from the chat. So I hope you're as excited as I am to listen. And now I'd like to hand it over to Sarah Wyman, who will lead us in a land acknowledgement.
Greetings and thank you for being with us. On behalf of the extended Valley community, We acknowledge with respect and gratitude that the land on which we live and that sustains us is on Turtle Island, commonly referred to as North America. We are in the Mahicatunk Valley, the river that flows both ways, known today as the Hudson Valley. The first people who lived here, where we presently stand, were the Esopus and Minisink peoples of the Lenni, Lenape, and Delaware. Wars and Indian removal policies forced the Lenape westward. Today, Lenape people belong to the Delaware Nation and Delaware Tribe of Indians in Oklahoma, the Stockbridge-Munsee community in Wisconsin, and the Munsee-Delaware Nation, Moravian of the Thames First Nation, and Delaware of Six Nations in Ontario. This statement was written by Emily Putoff, a SUNY New Paltz Art Department faculty member, with the advice of MFA student Erin Antonak, Anita Wolf Clan. On behalf of the SUNY New Paltz Sustainability Learning Community, the Black Lives Matter at School Coalition, and the Eddy at New Paltz, Melissa Paniagua and I thank the panelists for being here and Mohonk Consultations for their kind invitation to collaborate. We also welcome our guests around the world and invite you to please introduce yourselves in the chat by naming the land on which you stand. And next, we'd like to share a brief video by way of introduction. It's called Why Are the Black Farmers Vanishing? Produced by Sarah Solomon for Al Jazeera and by her permission.
My grandfather would say the land knows no color. Never mistreated anybody, people do.
This is the story of an injustice that begins with slavery, continues through decades of government-sponsored discrimination, and even now is a fight for survival. Black farmers have faced discrimination for centuries, and today there's fewer than 49,000 of them in the U.S. That's less than the entire student body of the University of Texas.
We had to fight for the land, fight for the equipment. But the white farmers around here, their land was inherited down.
Black farmers lost 80% of their land between 1910 and 2007, in large part because of systemic racial discrimination.
Folks are starting to realize that we don't actually have a future of farming unless we include all of the various ethnicities and races in this nation.
Leah Penniman knows a lot about the history of Black farmers in the U.S., in part because her grandmother was a farmer.
A lot of people don't know that the 12.5 million Africans who were kidnapped from their home were mostly rounded up because they were expert agriculturalists.
Even after the Civil War ended, the government never delivered on its promise of reparations. It said it would give freed people a plot no larger than 40 acres and a mule. It didn't.
Despite the fact that the promise never happened, we did manage to save enough money to purchase 16 million acres of land by 1910.
Black farming hit its peak in 1920, when nearly 1 million Black farmers worked the land. Many Black families across the South were sharecroppers. That meant they'd rent and farm small plots of land, and then the landowner would receive part of their crop. But high interest rates and unpredictable harvests often left sharecroppers, like John Boyd Jr.'s grandfather, indebted to landowners.
He would always wind up owing Mr. Harper money, and I couldn't figure that out. I said, how in the same world do you work all year, harvest a crop, and you actually owe the plantation owner money?
John is a fourth-generation farmer and the founder of the National Black Farmers Association. His family story is one with a landscape fertilized by Black labor. He is part of the 1.4% of Black people who make up the country's 3.4 million farmers. The U.S. government has restricted the success of Black farmers, and John would become a driver in their fight for equity.
I call the USDA the last plantation, the way that they're treated Black farmers. We've been degraded and humiliated.
For decades, the U.S. Department of Agriculture systematically favored white farmers by denying loans to Black farmers. Like his grandfather, John found himself financially struggling to keep his farm. He went to the USDA for aid, and the intense confrontation with a local USDA loan officer nearly ended in a physical fight.
The farm operating loan and the USDA loan officer, they spat on me. I just lost it. I literally wanted to whoop his ass. He said, if you don't learn how to talk to me, you're never going to get a loan in this county.
The Department of Agriculture is often the last resort for farmers when they don't qualify for loans from other sources. And discrimination was widespread at its local branches, which were largely run by all-white county committees.
We filed 3 applications at the USDA, and 6 months later, they claimed they had lost those loans or they couldn't find them.
Lester Bonner is a 74-year-old farmer from an agricultural family, and he says his fight with the USDA started in 1983. The land Bonner and his family tilled for 18 years was owned by a white man who promised them they'd get the first opportunity to purchase the grounds. But the government didn't make that easy.
We sat in the yard 2-3 hours, a couple of days, waiting on the guy to say he was going to come out and we'll fill the papers out. Nobody never showed.
Throughout the 1990s, it took an average of 60 days for white farmers to get their loan applications processed. But for black farmers, it took 220 days. Stories of unfair lending practices were so common among black farmers that a group of them, including John Boyd Jr., banded together. Their fight led John and 400 others to sue the government in a class action lawsuit known as Pigford versus Glickman in 1997.
I did a lot of the legal work because lawyers said there's no way you're going to win suing the federal government, especially a group of blacks to get paid for something, compensated for something. It was taboo. It had never been done before.
But the black farmers did win. Well, kind of. The government settled the case for a little more than $1 billion.
The black farmers case was like the next biggest thing to the Voting Rights Act as far as meaningful things that happened to black people in this country. A drop in the bucket for what happened from slavery to Jim Crow to sharecropping.
Nearly 16,000 farmers affected would receive $50,000. Some other farmers received more, but that was only if they filed their claims by a certain date. Many didn't. So Boyd found himself again fighting for nearly 40,000 claimants.
I can tell you, this took 30 years to do, so it wasn't something that transpired over a few years. We're talking about a 30-year period before farmers received their final checks out of the second lawsuit.
The follow-up case, known as Pigford 2, gave claimants an additional $1.25 billion in compensation. But for many black farmers, it was too late.
You know, the plaintiffs were in their 80s and 90s. It was important because it showed the nation that black farmers did not decline because of a lack of skill or a desire to leave the land.
Today, the average age of black farmers in the U.S. is about 60. And Leah Penniman's life mission is to cultivate the next generation of young black farmers. Her program at Soulfire Farm works with black farmers who are mostly in their 20s and 30s, offering week-long immersion courses.
It gives me hope, this sense that our generation is awakening to the call of coming back to the land.
Leah wants to show that young black farmers can still connect with the land, despite everything previous generations have endured.
Land is the basis of freedom, dignity, and equality. It allows people in our community to see more broadly what's possible for them and that they don't have to settle for what society has been told are the limits of what they can do.
That is my cue to speak. My name is Allison Espinosa. I am a farmer at Root Workers Croft. I'm the owner and farming manager at Root Workers Croft. I'm a certified veterinary technician. And I farm in West Bloomfield, New York, which is about 20 minutes south of Rochester in Ontario County. And that video, I hope everyone enjoyed it. It is extremely powerful. Leah Penniman is a very big mentor. She is an influence, a very large inspiration for a lot of young Black and brown farmers currently who are trying to get themselves back on the land in a way that is meaningful for them. And I truly, truly enjoyed that video, and I hope everyone else really, really enjoyed it as well. Without further ado, I'll sort of get into my piece, and sort of what I wanted to discuss in my segment is mainly wanting to talk to folks about the past of agriculture for Black folks. And having grown up in the South, most of my life, graduating high school in Florida, I didn't grow up with those visions of Black farming. I'm not sure about anyone else's educational background, but as a young child, I was never taught that Black folks had a place on land. I am of Afro-Caribbean descent, with also roots in Benin and Togo, so Puerto Rican, Dominican, Afro-Latino descent, as well as Benin and Togo, Nigeria. And with all of that being said, I never had these sorts of role models growing up. And so a lot of my education and sort of ideas of origins of Black folks on the land were mainly as slaves and working for others on the land, without having been taught that actually, just as Manya Leah Penniman said, which is, we were taken from our land because we were agriculturists, but that was never taught to us as children. As children, we were taught that our origins on the land were working for someone else, cultivating their crop, harvesting their crop, and in fact, not receiving anything in turn. But that is no longer the case. And so when we talk about bridging the past to the now and also into the future, we want to talk about sustainable and regenerative agriculture. In fact, the indigenous folks, whether they are of African descent or they are of Native descent, these folks were the ones who were the original agriculturists. And when I say that, I mean our people came from the ships with braids in their hair, with seeds braided into their hair, to bring seeds over to the new lands in which they were going to be taken to from their native homeland. And with that also in mind, you have to also understand that there was knowledge that was being stolen from these folks. There was labor that was being stolen from these folks, but that information and those sort of stories and those things and those traditions and practices of indigenous folks were passed down to our ancestors. And if we have that information now, we have that empowerment. We know that our origins on the land were not working for someone else. We were agriculturists in our own land and were successful at it. And that's why it was so successful here with agriculture. And if we look at some of our Black role models in agriculture, I hope everyone is familiar with George Washington Carver. When we speak about George Washington Carver, he was a botanist. He was known as the little plant doctor. He was born into slavery, and he was educated by his masters, I guess you could call it. He was educated by them because he had some health issues that didn't allow him to work in the field with the other slaves. And because of that, he was very educated in gardening and in home sort of, domestic sort of things like that and things like that. So he was very, very well known in his community as the little plant doctor. And he even would go and help other plantation owners with some of their issues with their crops. And so if anyone is familiar with his contributions to agriculture, they also know that regenerative agriculture was one of the main contributions of George Washington Carver. And so regenerative agriculture, as in regenerating the soil with either composting, adding nitrogen back into the soil through legumes like peanuts, and also rotational cropping with peanuts, legumes, as well as cotton. And so rotating these crops in order to enrich the soil and give back into the soil so that it gives back to the farmer. These are invaluable teachings from Black and brown folks that have literally been stolen and taken and attributed to other people or white farmers, more specifically. And if we have this information, we know that we have the knowledge, we have this in our blood and in our DNA. That is where the empowerment can come from, bridging us to the present as well as into the future. And so we're trying to really get into the space of getting folks. My main interest is also teaching those how to farm, whether that is on a small or on a large scale, seed keeping and seed starting. These are very important practices. Even city dwellers can start a little container garden. I teach herbs. I also teach folks how to take care of livestock with my animal husbandry background. That is another huge strength of indigenous folks. We're using livestock for grazing and rotational grazing. And with all of these things in mind, I think it's important that with that knowledge comes empowerment for the future of Black farmers. If we know that our ancestors did this, we know that we have this in our DNA, and we can return to the land, not for somebody else, but for ourselves and for our families and for our communities. And with all of these ideas and all of these pieces of knowledge that we'll be getting after this webinar, and ideally moving forward. And we have a lot of recommendations for books and resources by the end of this webinar. Then at that point, we can sort of move our communities into a place of getting foods that are also culturally appropriate. We all know that within COVID, I hope most folks began to realize that our food system is not as secure as we originally thought that it may be. And so that is why food insecurity is already an issue in Black and Brown communities. So if we can get more folks to grow, that is, to me, the main goal. And anyone is welcome to reach out to me via email or via any of my social media in order to contact me and ask me any questions about farming or livestock keeping. I did want to show briefly a little bit of seed keeping. So this is an indigenous practice of seed keeping. And so I have some bok choy, which is one of my favorite greens, which is high in vitamin C. And it helps with getting rid of those free radicals in one's body. So this is a little pod, okay? So all you would do is crack the pod. So you just do very gently. You also are to ask permission previously to harvesting. You should ask permission of the plant. Plants do have spirits. That is something that is believed by the ancestors. And the seeds will fall out into there. I'm not sure if you saw, there's about 20 seeds in one small pod. And I like to keep these in an airtight container and out of the sun. Try to keep them out of the too cool. And then I also wanted to show a highly revered plant by Africans, mainly West Africans from Tanzania. So I don't know if I have any Tanzanian folks here, but this is an African violet that has been grown by me. This is an African violet plant that does hold properties, spiritual properties, known for their symbolism and devotion and loyalty. And you can mainly use a cutting for this. These are very hard to grow from seed. But if you can find a cutting, or if you can grow them by seed, I would highly recommend stratification of the seed. And I can get into that if someone has a question about stratification. But the African violet is not edible. Do not ever eat it or consume it, but it is used in ceremony in African culture. I do also want to introduce someone who will be our next speaker, Riston Mays, who is also a colleague of mine in the Black Farmer Fund. We are both part of the Black Farmer Fund, which is a fund mainly focused, and all our goal is to get Black and Brown folks in food systems actors, whether they are chefs, entrepreneurs. They span the spectrum of Black and Brown food actors and food systems organizations, whether they're startups or individuals. And Riston is the farming assistant manager for Phillies Bridge Farm. He is from Chicago. And one of the main things that I have in common with Riston is our our true passion for sovereignty, land access for Black and Brown people, whether that is you come to our farm and you work with us, or you find a plot of land, or you come to the Black Farmer Fund and you apply with us, and we can assist you with acquiring funds for your startup. So please also keep that in mind, and we can talk more about that at the end. But without further ado, I will introduce Ristin, who I respect immensely, and I look forward to your part.
Thank you so much, Allison. It's really lovely to hear all of that context for the work that we're doing. I think that one of the reasons why I'm here today and why I got into agriculture in the first place was kind of doing that reflection on, what does it mean to be a melanated being, a Black person on the land, and sort of feeling that history and how those disconnects lead to a feeling of reconnection now in this moment. As we kind of found our place on land and growing food for others. So really appreciate that connection. It's also great to see those seeds. I'll get more into my own story, but I work for, Phillies Bridge, we're a CSA. And at first when I saw the seed pod, I was like, oh no, seeds. So I've been dealing with so many weeds lately, but so-called weeds are also so full of abundance. And so it's lovely to see that aspect of the plant being highlighted here. So thank you for that. Great. So again, my name is Ristin Mays. I'm the Assistant Farm Manager at Phillies Bridge Farm Project. We're a nonprofit CSA and educational farm, and we have a food justice focus. We're located in New Paltz, New York, right down the road from SUNY New Paltz. And so if anyone's ever in the area, please stop by. We're getting deeper and deeper into the growing season, and we'd love to say hi. We're going to be there for sure. And so my intention here is to also sort of invite any people who are listening, any Black people who are listening, to if you're interested in growing food or learning more about yourself as an earth worker, learning more about yourself in relation to land and community, to sort of take those extra steps and to find a pathway that works for you to sort of delving into that aspect of yourself. And so I guess I'll share a little bit of my journey, and then we'll transition into some more resources further in this chat. As Allison mentioned, I am from Chicago, Illinois. I do not come from a farming family. And actually much of my family, who were living, no one really owned land. So I was also feeling those disconnects that were brought on by the historical context for our being here. A lot of my family members had experiences with housing insecurity. And so I'm coming from this place of not really having any sort of perception of what it means to steward land, not really having an understanding of what rural space or, could really look like. And while I had a really deep love and appreciation for nature sort of growing up that I knew and understood about myself deeply, my only reference for agriculture and what that could look like in growing food was kind of like those really big grain fields or, the corn fields we'd see outside of the city. And so I didn't really develop that sort of perspective until I moved to the Hudson Valley around 2012. So in 2012, I attended Vassar College, and then from Vassar, right next door is Poughkeepsie Farm Project. And so for work study, for financial aid, I was an intern at Poughkeepsie Farm Project with their education team. And so I'll paint a little picture of how that work really inspired me to get more involved in the agricultural world. So some of our tasks for the ed crew, we would go around, we would show the farm, we would lead farm tours for students, elementary school students, middle school students, sometimes high school students at that time. And so we take a little walk around the field, and we would, we'd stop at carrots, for example. We'd see the carrots coming out of the ground, and we'd stop and we would ask, who knows what this vegetable is? Who can tell me what's growing right here? And so we get a series of responses. And then we take a fork and we dig up a little patch of carrots out of the ground, and you'd see the bright orange peeking out, and then you start to see some students' faces really light up. And it was then we kind of realized that this is a young person's first time really seeing where their food is coming from, seeing what it looks like to harvest a carrot out of the ground. And then we take that carrot, pick it out of the ground, and then we dust it off, wipe off some of those white roots, and we pass it around. Some people would taste it. Taste the sweetness of it, and getting a taste of the food as fresh as it can be straight from the soil. And so I think that was really exciting for myself and also a lot of the young people who were just seeing this for the first time. And then, we continue walking and we would see broccoli, for example, and we would say, oh, so broccoli is actually a flower. We're eating the flower and the stem of the plant. And we look at the broccoli head, a small little crown, but a really, really big plant with giant leaves. And that was another one that I remember struck me as I started to grow food. And also, I think a lot of students really found really interesting as we kind of got to know ourselves in relation to these plants that were growing out of the ground. And so we're kind of building up, that relationship between, the personal and the food system, seeing food growing at its source. And I found that really exciting. And so we keep walking, we come across the cover crop, as Allison said, we dig up those roots and see the nitrogen. We'd see the little root nodules that hold bacteria that fix nitrogen into the soil and talk about that and how does the cover crop nourish the soil. And then we'd head to the meditation garden. It's an herb garden that PFP stewards, and we'd stand underneath this canopy covered in grapevines, and we'd close our eyes, we'd breathe in, breathe out, and then we listen. We listen to the sound of wind, maybe insects are buzzing around. We might hear voices, the sound of our footsteps. We would smell our surroundings, whether they're flowers, dry air, the smell of herbs nearby. We'd reflect on the things that we felt and touched in the field, how that made us feel, how it felt to be in community with one another. Expressed appreciations for each other in the space, in the circle. And so, sharing that experience with all these young people for me as a student as well was a really profound experience. And it was really exciting, I think, particularly because I think, for me, growing up from a very early age, I really struggled with depression and anxiety. And so being in this space, having lived much of my life struggling with these issues of mental well-being, experiencing that, through schooling and college, particularly struggling with that, while trying to complete my time at Vassar, I noticed that, as I was learning more about myself in relation to, the community that we were forming here and all of this knowledge that we were building around land and our relationship to land and food, I was feeling like this was the kind of place where I felt most at peace, where I felt like the inklings of just, a healing process just getting started. And that was really powerful because I think if you have dealt with mental health issues, that feeling of hopefulness or that feeling of hopelessness can be very, very ever present. And so to be in a farm space and realizing like, oh, there's a sense of like generation here. There's like a generative feeling here. This is like a reciprocal sort of feeling going on here, kind of gaining like nourishing yourself, in relation to the space and also having a chance to eat this healthy food and to be in community with others who are also sort of, gaining that sort of sense of self and excitement. That was really powerful for me. So after a year of, after graduating, I decided I would see if I would, if I could handle a full season on the farm, doing actual farm work. And so that's how I landed at Philliesbridge. I decided to apply to their apprenticeship program, an apprenticeship being a space where it's designed to be educational, to understand how to grow food for a CSA, maybe to create a pathway towards farm management or other types of earthwork. And so here I am 4 years later, still working in that space and really still continuing to learn and grow and be in community with others. And so I offer that information to, again, invite anyone who's thinking about, how can I get involved in food? How do I find resources on land or funding or internships or apprenticeships? How do I find a place where I can sort of, get that access to land? And access here is really key because I would not have otherwise in this sort of way, develop my own healing journey without having access to land in the first place through my employment at these small farms. How do I gain that access and really work those intuitions and build up that sense of self in relation to land and space? And so just as Allison mentioned, I'm also super available to talk. I can post my email address in Instagram and chat if anyone ever wants to reach out. If any Black people want to reach out and learn more or just be in communication and conversation around, how to get your feet wet farming or how to, deal with anything that you're kind of going through in your journey towards working land and being in community with land, I'm super available for that. And so I'll be sharing some resources later. We have a really long resource list that can sort of highlight some of the ways that land seekers can find access to or build up their relationships to land, and also how landowners or people with resources can go ahead and share those. But until then, I really love to pass this off to Shaniqua Bowden, who's the head of cultural engagement at the Kingston Land Trust. Kingston is now my home as a transfer from Illinois, and I'm finding a lot of love and community here. And so Shaniqua will talk to us more about how land trusts can play a role in creating and offering Black people, Black community land in terms that are equitable and in terms that sort of have that futurity and perpetuity tied into it. So thank you all for listening, and I'll post my information in the chat if anyone wants to talk more after this.
Hi everyone, I'm Shaniqua Bowden, and I am the head of cultural engagement at the Kingston Land Trust. I love this conversation that is being held tonight. Everything that's been said just completely warms my heart. And I thought that video was extremely, extremely powerful. And so, yeah, I've been thinking about the questions that, we have come here to answer tonight, which are, why isn't there more Black land ownership and stewardship? And questions like, what keeps people of color away from ownership and stewardship? And so that video was certainly an example of that. But as I contemplate these questions even more, it just makes me think of like the deep-rooted answers to these questions. And I think we must first, really acknowledge the extractive culture that we have perpetuated here in America, the extractive culture that we're all a part of, with single-use plastics and, just the rat race of going to work every day and kind of ignoring the world that is around us. And so in my next statement, I definitely echo the words of Ed Whitfield, who is an agricultural mentor to a lot of us. We live in a society that can't tell the difference between what should be held as sacred and the meaning of sacred, and knowing anything to be sacred to us, and what is instrumental. So that's really where we are. And when we think of life itself, the way in which we behave, like actions speak louder than words, life itself has been treated as instrumental in so many instances. We are disconnected from our emotions as a people. And as a result of this imbalance, we are facing right now the 6th mass extinction of wildlife on Earth. And this is where more than 500 species of land animals are on the brink of extinction. And so we're facing that now. Within the next 20 years, these animals will have been extinct. But this is also the same number that we were facing in the last century. So this is not new to us in a sense. And yet we continue to, continue on with our practices of what we've been doing. And people ask like, why is it important to have a relationship with land? Why is it important to look at things in a different way? Why is it unique for people of color to own land versus white people owning land? And so we're in a time frame where 98% of the acreage in the US is owned by whites. And then you have this, which creates this disconnection for people of color who don't want to just own land. We want to steward land, and we want to be in relationship with land. And when we are in relationship with land, that's what balance looks like. And so these are many of the things that we really need to contemplate, like what the difference is. Just recently, I learned that lobster is immortal. They have an enzyme in their bodies that allows them to be immortal. So that means that lobster will swim around in the ocean and continue to grow and continue to live and never die. So of course, we all know the number one cause of death for lobster, right? It's human enjoyment and 5-star restaurants. So, so that's what happens when we look at life forms as instrumental, and instead of looking at them as something that should be held as sacred. So I also wanted to identify the fact that we're living in a time frame where corporations have obtained the status of rights as people. So now we look at corporations as people, and the things all around us, like the nature, the trees, you know, the greens that we eat that give us substance, all of these obvious life forms that give us oxygen and respite and beauty. Let's not forget that. We look at those as commodities, right? So I'm posing this for us all to see how imbalanced and upside down our perspectives are at this point in time. And so this is just how we once looked at people, at enslaved people, as commodities, right? Once upon a time, the same way that we look at nature today. And so it's almost as if I stand before you today to prove, you know, the case for both people of color and nature, as the two of us should both have human rights. And that is, you know, that's a case that goes against the atrocities of our colonial brothers and sisters that use various life forms as instrumental for each other's entertainment. And so it's not to say that we shouldn't have enjoyment upon this earth, but when we contemplate these questions, it's looking at how do we have happiness that is also respectful of other life forms. And I think that's a very, very important point. And so just going into our work at the Land Trust, the Kingston Land Trust, people ask, what is a land trust and what does a land trust do? We protect and preserve environmentally and socially significant land for the common good. And so recently, we've had a number of projects, but one I'd like to bring to your attention is the purchase and protection of the Pine Street African Burial Ground. So we do some listening to Black farmers of our own at the Kingston Land Trust, whereas then we launch a conversation called Land in Black Hands. It's an annual conversation that we've been holding since 2019. We generally hold this program every February during Black History Month Kingston. And it's a event that we launch with the public to kind of talk about where people of color are regarding land ownership and stewardship, and what their challenges are, what their successes have been, and what creative solutions are people employing when it comes to this topic. And so with that, in the same year of 2019 that we launched Land in Black Hands, we also launched, we found out about a burial ground that was in the rear of a residential property where enslaved Africans were buried during the 17 and 1800s. And so when we found out that this property was being used as a house, as a residential property, we launched a fundraising campaign to raise the money with the community to purchase and protect this this property. And so it took a year, but for the fact that we were raising approximately $200,000, we think that was we think it was amazing, and we actually gained a lot of notoriety for that project. But I think some of the things that we learned is about working with the community, working to change the hearts and minds of people to make this project a success. I remember tabling at a number of places, I can't tell you how many, but I remember specifically a white man saying that he would donate some money, but he doesn't, he's like, don't get your hopes up. I don't really think this is going to be successful, seeing as in you guys are raising money for, a Black burial ground. And so, again, a year later, we were able to raise that amount of money. We were able to raise the critical mass that it took for us to band together as a community and purchase and protect that property in connection, in partnership with Scenic Hudson and Harambe, which was absolutely monumental. So it was this year, actually in 2021, that we were able to turn over ownership to Harambe, which is a Black-led organization, and they are currently stewarding that land that's known as the Pine Street African Burial Ground. And so again, in a time where 98% of the acreage is owned by whites in the US, we did two monumental things. We, as a white-led organization, we put land into Black hands directly. And since that time, the lands in the back was turned into a community garden. So therefore, folks in the community are able to team up with Harambe and garden and grow food and be autonomous in that space. And it's just wonderful. Another component of all of this is also uplifting Black leadership, which is very important. So as a white organization, we were able to stand behind a Black organization to support and uplift Black leadership. And I think we need more of that. We definitely need more of that. We need more giving. We need more long, intense conversations around this work, because it wasn't easy for us as a white-led organization to find our place in this work and to support these organizations that were partners with us, and to just do what's never really been done before. It's been done, but not on a large scale. And this is what's needed. And so, I just want to also highlight the importance of uplifting Black leadership, because many of times, we got questions, and there were questions within our own board, that asked, should we continue to own the land? Should we continue to hold title of the land? And if so, why should we hold title of the land? Are we being paternalistic in that work? Should we trust a new organization such as Harambe to lead this mission? And, just by having a little bit of faith and trust and answering all those questions positively with a positive mind, and continuing to back that organization, we got through it. And we also were able to write our first culturally significant easement, which again, is something that's not normally being done. So when we came to the table with lawyers who wanted to talk about ownership, and we wanted to talk about stewardship, and all of that pushback that we had to incorporate regarding the language around, what a cultural easement is, was very monumental. And so to this day, we are still continuing to tell this story. And oftentimes, we come into a space to tell this story, and it's connecting with another white organization that wants the story told in a specific way. And we have to continue to push the envelope and say, hey, we want to tell this story, but we also need to bring in our Black leaders to help stand beside us and tell this story, because we don't own it, So that's the work of the Kingston Land Trust, along with many other things that we're doing, which is continuing to launch the Land in Black Hands conversation, and many other programs that you'll also hear about later on today in this program. Thank you.
Thank you again, Allison, Shaniqua, and Riston, for all you've given us. Melissa Paniagua, a recent SUNY New Paltz graduate in Black Studies and Finance, will continue the conversation with our panelists. She has a collection of questions that she, from SUNY New Paltz students that she's gathered. And so our panelists will continue with Melissa moderating. Thank you, Melissa.
Good evening, everyone. It's so great to be here. And thank you again, Riston, Shaniqua, and Allison for your amazing contributions. I know we all took some piece of information from this beautiful, beautiful event so far. So we have some pre-submitted questions from SUNY students that we would like the panelists to answer. So the first question is for Allison. What are people's first reactions when they hear you are a Black farmer?
Well, usually it's not a reaction that is heard. It's seen, and it's usually really that sort of face, that sort of very, very surprised look. And usually they find out that I'm a farmer, not by me saying it, but because I'm walking around in bib overalls, very dirty. My hair looks not as the way that it looks right now. And I maybe have a duck or a chicken or some sort of animal that I'm holding in my yard. And usually that's how a lot of folks learn that I'm a farmer. And even in my local community, I live in a more rural, little more rural space outside of Rochester. I may have mentioned that in the beginning of my introduction, but that a lot of folks will go to the store in their tractor. And so no one expects me to be doing that, of course. And so it's always very, very surprising. And when I tell other folks, other Black and brown folks that I'm a farmer, it's this level of intrigue, and they really want to know how I got into farming and whether I came from a family of farmers. And there is farming in my background, my ancestry back on the islands, but not here in the States. And that's not something I was very, very close to growing up. And so, you know, the reaction is a mixed bag, but it's usually pleasantly surprised and definitely wanting to know more. And I'm always willing to share my story or, you know, stories of other Black and brown farmers that I know, because there's not a whole ton of us, but we're a small community and we all tend to know each other. And so the reaction is not what they expect. Let's just say that.
Thank you for answering. That's actually very interesting because the first time I heard about this event, I actually never met a Black farmer before. So it's crazy to see how like people's first reactions are when that happens. I also want to let everyone know you can definitely just add more questions to the chat if you're open to answering more questions as well. So the second question is sorry. So the second question is for Riston. What is the most important / fun thing about farming?
I have lots of answers to this. I really do enjoy farming. But a couple that really stand out that I'm not sure people who haven't farmed might be able to guess is I think just generally speaking, the timing of it all, I find really um, just really beautiful. Kind of getting to watch on like a month-to-month scale or like a day-to-day scale, a week-to-week scale, things going from seed to a little seedling in the greenhouse, and then you plant it in the soil, and then it's taller and taller, and seeing those flowers make fruits. Like that all feels really, really good. And then by around now, we actually just started our CSA. We get to see all of these people coming around to actually eat the food. We get to harvest all the kale, harvest all the radishes, and just like knowing that you and however many hands, it's a crew of 5 of us this year, so all 5 of us in our hands really put that all out there and set that intention and let that grow and nurture it into feeding people. So that feels really, really good. And just because I spent the latter half of my day today weeding carrots, I will say that weeding things and sitting, inching along in the soil, it can be very meditative, though it is repetitive. And it's worthwhile getting your hands dirty and seeing how that feels sometimes too.
Thank you, Riston. If other panelists would like to also answer this question, particularly Allison, because you do actually have a farm yourself.
I would love to answer that question. Thank you, Melissa. So I have an herb farm. I also do farm produce and greens and flowers, medicinal flowers. I will be getting honeybees this June. So well, actually, yeah, this month, later this month then. So we'll see if the bees are my favorite part. But for right now, my favorite part has truly been the livestock husbandry. And so with my background in as a veterinary technician, obviously, I feel very, very kindred with animals. I am also referred to as Dr. Doolittle in some networks. And so animals have always been my main interest. And so really having chicks and ducklings and raising rabbits and breeding rabbits, having those small animals and then actually raising them and helping their mothers to raise them has really been, I would say, one of the most rewarding things for me, is really just actually seeing the environment that you can keep your animals in and watching them thrive and seeing them thrive based on the conditions that you sort of help to facilitate alongside nature. I never say that I'm, working again. I do not work against nature. I work with nature, and really that's what anyone can ever ask for, is to be able to work alongside nature. And that has truly been one of the most rewarding things, is seeing my animals thrive. And whether that means laying a bunch of eggs and leaving them for me, or laying a bunch of eggs and laying on them and I will leave them be. But at the very least, that's how you know your animals are thriving.
Thank you. Beautiful answer. Appreciate it. This one is for Shaniqua. What are some ways to access land if you don't own land for farming?
So the Kingston Land Trust has a program, a land matching program, actually, where we we launched a portal. And with that portal, we've been able to match people who have land in excess with people who are looking to use land. And through that, they make an agreement to use land for free, which is great. So, you can use land for anything you like, as long as the owner agrees to it. But even if you don't want to grow food, and you just need to be outside, maybe you're in an apartment and you have kids that need a place to run and just smell a fresh air and be in relationship with land to get there, just to get that that first experience. That's a good reason to take advantage of our land matching portal as well. So so that's what we've currently done to support that, to support people who don't own land.
Thank you so much. Now, the next question is for Allison. What advice can you offer city dwellers who want to farm?
That is a great question. So for city dwellers, one of my main recommendations are, if they have a Cornell Cooperative Extension in their local area, that is a really good way to get connected with farmers and resources with farming as well. But also another great way to get started into farming or even gardening. Gardening is a really great sort of segue into farming. You eventually can get yourself into that sector. But if you have a lack of land, there's always seed starting in containers, and also trying to see it through your Cornell Cooperative Extension if there are areas outside or farmers outside of where you live, maybe in a closer rural area. Like myself, I'm only about 15-20 minutes away from Rochester. So, it wouldn't be too far for someone to come drive to my farm, or, I'll pick them up. And they can come, work with me. Now, and another recommendation I would have is community gardening. In the cities, there are a lot of community gardens, really depending on where you live. There may be some community gardens, so I would definitely look into that in your area and see if you have any. And if you don't, you can start one yourself, and knock on a couple of your neighbors' doors and see if they would be interested in harvesting and sowing and sort of having that culturally enriching experience.
Love to also add to that. If you're in a city and you are a part of, if you know where your local farmers market is, like, go talk to the farmers there. It's always nice to really connect with someone who's actually growing the food, and also I think as a farmer, we don't do markets, but I think, we always appreciate getting to connect with people personally. You may find an opportunity to go visit the land and do some work there, or otherwise walk the space and get a feel for that land itself, or even purchase some food, or, connect with your friends, buy some food, like get to know a new vegetable. Cooking is another really, really great access point for people who are into that energy in that space, to just like taste something new and to really get a personal connection to the food that is being produced. And I think that's also something that I, as a farmer, value, is when we grow something fun or interesting, showing people what that means, whether it's the cultural significance or just like the flavor or the way it was cultivated. It's really a craft. And I think that any way to be in relation is a valuable way.
Yeah, that's awesome. I also want to add to it. I know that I'm from the Bronx, New York specifically. There are a few community gardens, and they actually have a farmers market very close to a park. Um, it's pretty much like a diverse set of farmers markets. Like, it's not just fruits and vegetables. You can get a lot more like resources, supermarkets with like fresh food in them. So there's different things that you can do in them as well. So I want to pull a question from the chat. Tracy asks Shaniqua, do you have any resources to share on how the Kingston Land Trust, as a white-led organization, built trust with BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, People of Color organizations, or any resources on being a Black person in a predominantly white organization?
Well, in terms of building trust, I have to say it takes a lot of listening, definitely takes a lot of listening. And you have to be the type of person who wants to do that work. At everything comes down to personalities and who you're working with, and it's also cultural, and so as the cultural engagement, head of cultural engagement at my office, I'm also having a lot of these talks to kind of bridge the gap between the understandings of the cultures, saying like, well, this is how we would normally operate, or this is how we might respond to something like that. And it's not necessarily to be the speaker for all people of color, but sometimes there is a general sense of how things can be taken. And just like, like, when you're working with a culture that represents an organization, and they often like to have all their I's dotted and all their T's crossed. But sometimes, with BIPOC people, they like to, they work in a more spiral, I'll say like a more spiral type of format, where, you come, you work on something, some questions can be unanswered, and that's okay. We'll get more information and come back to the table later. So there's not necessarily this rigid urgency to have everything squared away at once, at the moment, and those are sort of the things that you can help people to understand, to bridge those gaps. And so just tell them to work at a slower pace. And so if someone is willing to do that, then you can have a winning combination there. So I would say it's the understanding that not everything is going to happen in one day or 1 week. It definitely takes time. And I mean, it's a relationship that we're still working on. But I think with all of the, we started with the listening. And so with that, folks felt that we were moving at their pace. And with that, we were able to build trust more. And then people of color were also able to speak up and sort of take agency in the process. Because a lot of times when we're working with white organizations, you want to see if this white organization is claiming that they're willing to work with people of color. It's almost like, well, if that's the work that you're going to do, then you will find space for me within your organization. And when I see that that space has been made, then I will take my place in it. We don't come in pushy, saying like, oh, you said you were going to do this and you were going to do that. So we often observe and see where that space has actually been made. And when we see that the space has been made, we then fill it and take agency. And so that's just another way of honoring those relationships. And it's the same thing almost as a person of color working there. You know, there have been long heart-to-hearts about how I feel. And when my voice is heard, you know, when it's being received on the other end, then it's not taken as disrespect or the fact that I'm, you know, can seem insubordinate or anything like that. It's ingested. And sometimes we may not understand it at first sight or, you know, during the first conversation. But if we go away and we revisit, then, you know, things get better. But then also there's the resources all around us. At some point I'm always involved in these anti-racist conversations all over Kingston. So like KingstonReads.org is an organization that I help moderate their panels. And so they've offered a lot of books, one by Reesma Minikim, and he talks about the white body and the black body and, you know, how these things are in our DNA. And so a lot of those like resources and conversations that I came across and learned about elsewhere, I was able to share with our staff. And our staff was able to take time and watch those videos and delve into those conversations and process that, and then come back to the table and say, wow, you know, I learned a lot from that conversation, and ask questions and being open-minded and not feeling like, I mean, some people, granted, don't feel like it's their responsibility to teach. But I feel like because I'm invested in people learning, you know, I have taken on some of that responsibility to teach, and I'm fine with that. So.
Thank you so much. That was very knowledgeable in terms of like where our resources can come from. This is for any panelists who would like to answer. From Erica Brown. She asks, how do you think that folks who are listening on this conversation, similar to this one, who are allies, can support the efforts to place land in BIPOC hands?
I could get started if no one else wants to start that one. Awesome. So there's a growing number of resources, I think, that are available. I'll say first and foremost, to be very direct, to most directly support, you know, the transfer of land to Black people, to BIPOC communities. If you have land or you have those resources, is to make a direct offer, offering it directly, giving it. That's the most direct answer that I have to that question. But also, there are resources where there's, you know, ways of finding land matching programs. There's like Kingston Land Trust land matching. There's also the Soulfire Farm reparations map, and let me post these in the chat real quick. These are a part of the larger resource document that we'll share out at the end. But I think there's a really great link. The first link on that resource document, which you'll see later, is called Resources for Land Justice. And I'll just quickly grab that link. And under the tab, let's see, it's like I don't have it pulled up in front of me right now. I'm trying to find it. It's one of the tabs at the bottom that sort of speaks to those different relationships to land access, offerings that you can make, and ways of sort of naming the relationship that you want to have with land as someone who's looking for land, and also ways of naming the offer to those who are looking for land. So I think that's a great resource, the document that I just posted. And then also the Soulfire Farm reparations map, which I will quickly send that link out. Is also very useful in finding the specific requests from people around the New York State, or I think it might be a national map, I'm not exactly sure, who are looking for you know, land for whatever their projects are. I also think that, you know, if you're going to be offering land to share, it's really important to be mindful of what does that relationship look like. Like if you're a white person, for example, sharing land for a BIPOC community member, are you inviting them to a space that's predominantly white? Are you inviting them to a space without, you know, talking to your neighbors about how there will be people coming through, so that no one feels like they have to be, you know, fearful of like the police getting called on them, which has happened recently to a community member in Kingston who was just doing some gardening in someone's backyard, or, you know, how does that relationship look? And are you trying to negotiate with the person who you're offering land to? Like, are you telling them how to use the space? Are you telling them how, you want the space to be used? Or is it more of like an active like offering? And so I think it's really important to be thinking about that as you work through what it means to be an ally and what it means to offer those kinds of resources to others. So I'll post the larger resource document later because I'm having a little trouble finding out my links on my screen, and also open the floor up to everybody else who wants to answer.
Yes, I definitely echo Riston. I was just thinking earlier also that, even after people of color get land or gain land to steward, it's not the end of it. There's so many other things that happen on the back end. I mean, I'm reading about heirs property and how certain certain businesses, corporations invest money in the Mississippi Delta and are working to take land away from people of color. So here we are talking about how to increase land ownership, and in other parts of the world, they're still working on decreasing land ownership. And so so also I wanted to echo Riston when I was reading Braiding Sweetgrass, and it's by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I'm sure all of you know of the book. But in that book, she's talking about like the gifting economy. And so, when you think about, again, as I brought up earlier, like our extractive culture and the fact that some of us own tons of land. So like, how much land does one person need? Is all of that land sacred to you? Or is it just hoarding? Are you hoarding land? Are you using land? What's your goal? And so those are some things to think about as owners.
I did also want to briefly add a little bit of numbers and statistics to sort of back what Riston and Shaniqua have both been able to very eloquently get the message across, that even though there are Black owners of land and Black farmers, for instance, versus white farmers, I believe there was a statistic that after some research and study, the Center for American Progress found that a full-time white farmer will make around over $47,000 a year full-time farming. And that's depending on their crop, of course. And a Black farmer will statistically make $2,000 a year. So why are we seeing such disparities in our numbers? Why are we seeing such disparities? Even there may not be even a disparity in our land. There's certainly not a disparity in the quality of our land. And is there a disparity in the produce, in the product? Highly unlikely. Most likely would be lack of access to markets, lack of access to resources, as well as sort of being boxed out of a lot of the communities that could truly use and or pay appropriately for our produce. And so there are a lot of disparities that we see with Black farmers, that even if we do have land, we are making a sad amount of money less than a white farmer that could have equally as good, if not better, produce. So when we see these numbers, we really have to look at what is keeping Black farmers from not only being able to acquire land, but also being able to, when they do acquire land and we do have a product, why it is that we are making such a disproportionately less amount of money in order to continue on our farming. So if you really think about it, we're actually losing money trying to get our products out into the hands, into the bellies, and to the tables that need it the most.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you all for these contributions. There is another question directly speaking about what we were talking about. How will the $4 billion Biden plan help out Black farmers, if in any way?
I could touch on that. So I believe you're referring to the American Rescue Plan. And so actually I have a little resource on that. I'm just gonna pull it up really quick so I can read directly from that. So one of the ways in which Black farmers / institutions that are Black led or Black farm institutions, Black nonprofits can find funding from the USDA is through what they call the 2501 program. That's called the Socially Disadvantaged Outreach and Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers. And it's kind of an unfortunate title, the use of the word socially disadvantaged, which I think has some heavy implications, but what they're referring to is really, you know, people of color. Women might also be included in that group, but as far as I know, it's people of color is who they're referring to, those who have historically been, you know, denied access to land and all of that kind of stuff. And so you can apply for funding through 2501 to support projects that impact socially disadvantaged communities, which ideally are led by, you know, people of color, indigenous folks. And so Biden's American Rescue Plan, I believe, does call for the for increased funding, and I think I heard that it was like tripling the funding to the to that program. So that's one of those ways that I believe the American Rescue Plan is aimed to sort of repair that relationship. And I think that it's also an interesting question because, you know, we've been talking about, you know, land access and how do you get land into Black hands. I think these are all questions that touch on the idea of reparations and, you know, does funding the USDA and these different programs, does that really equate to an act of reparations? Does that really, you know, repair all of those generations of lost, disconnected relationship to land? How does that new relationship that one might have to land by getting, you know, debt relief? I think debt relief is one of the measures in the American Rescue Plan for Black farmers. I think they're also trying to create like equity, like diversity and equity sorts of roles within the USDA to create checks and balances and to prevent further discrimination, kind of stemming from the Pickford versus Glickman lawsuit, which we heard about in the video. So there are all these measures to sort of, you know, change that particular organization built into the American Rescue Plan. And I think that those are worth looking into and also following up with and saying, you know, is that money going out? Is that money actually going to Black farmers? Who are the Black farmers that they're going to and how is it getting used? And, you know, what does that actually lead to? Are we actually seeing, like Allison said, a resurgence of regenerative principles? Are we seeing more factory farming? What are we seeing in these outcomes and who's tracking it? So I can send out a link to, this is New York City foodpolicy.org that speaks more about the Emergency Relief for Farmers of Color Act, which is built in, I believe, in the American Rescue Plan. I'd also like to use this as an opportunity to highlight the work of Black Farmers United. Black Farmers United has 9 solutions. This is a Black farmer-led, Black food activist-led organization based in New York State. And here's their page right here in the chat. This group is advocating for 9 solutions to addressing racial inequity in New York agriculture, which includes creating opportunities for ownership. You know, Allison, myself, and Shaniqua, we all have different relationships to land. Shaniqua and I, or Allison and I, you know, we are either landowners or we are, I was, you know, in an apprenticeship program, which leads, you know, pathways to farm management. You know, we're not necessarily migrant farm workers. We're not necessarily coming from a background where we're being paid by the bushel and all of that kind of stuff. And so we want to see more opportunities for ownership for all Black workers, Black best workers, undocumented farm workers to become business owners. Funding Black farm startups. So that's speaking to kind of like having $10 million of funding for the Black Farmer Fund, which again is a Black-led, Black food system actor-led initiative. So you know that, you know, we're working within the community for the community rather than funneling it to a white organization who redistributes it, and so on. So if you take a look at the Our Solutions page, definitely take a look at those and speak to your legislators and your local politicians to make sure that they know this is something that we care about and we want to see implemented in all of these policy reforms. So similarly, as you're learning more about the American Rescue Plan, the Justice for Black Farmers Act, which was recently also put out to the Senate, which I will also post a link to, information on that page. We want to make sure that these values are all aligned because policy can be a great way to create these tangible outcomes, but you know, policy needs to be informed by what the community really needs and really wants. And I think it's our duty to also be informed and to help shape policy so that it really reflects, you know, So when we're moving around all this money, all this money and all these resources and land, it's really going to things that we feel in our hearts are representative of our values.
Yeah, could I add something to that? I just want to, I would like to highlight something that you said about funds and how they're being used. I think that when these articles come out, people and organizations and initiatives want to be held in a good light, saying that they have put X amount of dollars towards Black farmers and all of these things, but it's really about the follow through. I've so many times I've seen announcements and you're sitting on these very committees that are struggling to bring these solutions to life. You're sitting amongst committees that are white led and the folks running them don't actually want to help create the solutions, or they don't want to listen to the people of color who are impacted by these issues, who are sitting right there and feel like they have solutions to the issues. They feel that they know best. And therefore, it's this very long bureaucratic, route to getting to the solution. And sometimes it actually never happens. So I'm saying that to say, don't be fooled by the headlines. It's actually about the follow through and the projects that actually come to fruition. And so, yeah, follow up on that specifically. I feel like, where we are is exactly where they wanted us to be. So we have to recognize that. They eradicated, the indigenous population, not totally, but that was the aim. Why? Because they did not want to promote a culture of having relationships with the land. They don't want that to be so, which is why the majority of the population, doesn't think that way. They want capitalism to survive, and capitalism survives off of extraction.
You. And our last question, thank you everyone who has been submitting questions. We're also going to have a resource list with all of these resources that were not only in the chat, but in addition to other resources that we have. It's going to be in a document. So the last question is, what brought you to farming? And this is for all of the panelists.
I suppose I'll start. So what brought me into farming was, and I'm going to say this honestly and truthfully, because it was not that I knew that I had some ancestry on the island, I don't know, probably 30 or 40 years ago, of landowners. It was the birth of my son. So actually not even the birth of him, when I was pregnant with him. And from his inception at that point, I was so much more aware of what I was putting in my own body and what that was actually developing his body. And so that just gave me a whole new meaning to the nutrients that I was putting into myself, the way that I thought, the energy that I held in my body, and actually how those things correlated with each other, my nutrition versus my mental health. And so during my pregnancy with my son is when I totally revamped my diet. And not only did I revamp my diet, a lot of my mentality shifted with that as well. And at that point, I began to pay a lot more attention to the things that they give children, candies and all these things you see on the shelves for children, and how we're also seeing a higher deficits with children and with their development, and how we're seeing so many more children now having health issues and nutritional issues and malnourishment. And these were things that were of the utmost importance to me. And at that point, I wanted to find myself a parcel of land and begin to grow my own food and give my son an enriching experience in which he would see food as a way of his health and food as medicine. And I truly believe that has made all the difference in the way he eats and the way that he views the world. All he'll do is talk about the farm animals and all these different veggies and fruits, and and gets a lot of his little 5-year-old friends interested in farming and in gardening and things like that. And so that is what really catapulted me into farming and gardening and truly getting back to the roots of our ancestors.
Yes, thank you for that, Allison. I think, yeah, kind of as I already pointed out, a lot of my foundational interest in agriculture was really just that deep feeling of connection that I got that related to my healing process. Yeah, I feel like I really do think that farming and growing food and earthwork is all such a labor of love. And for me personally, just that practice really brings me a lot of life and joy. And I love the community that emanates from that. And so I think why I've held so tightly to it is because it feels so like deeply intertwined with my sense of self and energy moving forward every day, you know. So yeah, and also, you know, wanting, I think I also have a deeper desire to sort of bridge those disconnections growing up, you know, thinking about my origins in Chicago, thinking about my transfer to New York and what that means in terms of place, because farming is very place-based, you know, on the land. And so wanting to sort of reconcile all of those different moving parts and find ways to feed people, but also to feed people who, you know, fed me growing up, you know, family, community, and all of that. So I think there's a lot of things that, you know, I'm juggling to figure out how to clarify, and farming feels for me to be a way to do that. Thankfully, again, in the situation that I have, able to be getting paid well enough and all that too. So grateful for that.
So I'm not specifically a farmer, but I think like from a child, I've always been interested in this work. I've always been environmentally conscious. So I would definitely say that that is in the DNA, you know, even if you don't know your roots, and to later find out that I do have native roots like Cherokee and Blackfoot within my family. And so with that, you know, I grew up in Virginia, and the land was like my only place to go for fun and respite. And so while my friends were, you know, capturing posters of the latest pop star, you know, I was making posters, save the swamps and recycling is important and things like that. And I would decorate my room with all of these messages, not even really knowing, like, you know, I'm living in the country. It wasn't even hardly a thing, you know. But this is where my interests lied at the time, and so since then it's just been innate within me growing up. And so, you know, coming back to New York, in the city where my grandmother, who, you know, used to live in North Carolina, migrated to New York, living there for over 40 years, you know, she was the cook in the family, and she was the one who would say, make sure you eat your fruits and your vegetables and drink more water and things like that. And so, you know, but she also got sick. She was also a diabetic. And those were some of the things that I saw growing up, you know, trying to take care of her when she lost her leg and things like that, and bringing her the bowls to the bedside so that she could continue to cook for the family, because that's what she did. And so it was through that, you know, you say, I also don't want to be sick. How do I not perpetuate, you know, the things that I've seen that are not necessarily the healthiest in life? And so that has brought me to growing my own food, and then the rituals that go along with that, and go along with the gratitude. You know, the earth gives to us, then why wouldn't we naturally want to give back? You know, and that comes to learning more about the gifting economy, and how we can change and go back to the ways that are minus the convenience, but more about being in right relationship.
Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists, for answering these lovely questions, both from SUNY students as well as in the chat as well. We're just going to do a quick transition to the PowerPoint slide with the resources that we were speaking about here, as well as the ones that were collected in a few days.
I think that's me. Thanks everybody so much for attending and listening to us today. I just posted in the chat a link to a document that was compiled by a dear friend of mine who also now works at the Kingston Land Trust. Their name is Jordan Williams. They're the seasonal land steward at the Kingston Land Trust. They have compiled a document called Cooperation and Land Resources, from which there's a myriad of links to Black-led, BIPOC-led, queer-led, food and land cooperative work, a number of books and podcasts that I think are really worth listening to really help support anyone in their journey to figuring out what kind of relationship you have to land and yourself, whether it's spiritual or if it's through growing food or if it's, in a political context. There's so much in this rich document. So thank you, Jordan, for compiling that for us and offering it as a point of reference and return for our future work. And if anyone feels inclined to save the Zoom chat, all of those resources around food policy, the Justice for Black Farmers Act, Black Farmers United, definitely check out their website. Yes, thank you all so much for being here today with us. You can also scan this QR code to access the resource list. And it will also be posted on Mohawk Consultation's website, mohawkconsultations.org/news. Any of those addresses there.
So thanks everybody who has been here with us tonight. I personally am very touched and very educated, much more so than I was an hour and a half ago. I hope you will check out the resources, go to Mohawk Consultation's website, and keep on joining us for other events. I personally feel like this event could be made into a conference. There's just so much more to explore here. So be well, digest all this good stuff, and hope we'll see you soon.